I will show you that synchronization in brain related to seizures is not easy. So whenever you think seizure is a synchronized state, forget it. And if you think that there's a transition to a seizure where you see an increase in synchronization, forget it. If you think that seizures stop by some active mechanism, and I tell you that the stopping of the seizure is due to a synchronization mechanism, you won't believe that. This is what we learned over the last 25 years. Let me start with, how does this work? Doesn't work. Some notions that came up when we had the first seizure prediction conference in 2001. Yeah? So this is the question of why do we want to predict seizures? I mean, we heard many, many things this morning about how can we control seizures. You give some drugs, and then you realize 70% doesn't work. Doesn't work means you are not able to sufficiently control the amount of seizures in the subject. Yeah? We had this definition, 2 per year. Then you have epilepsy. A sufficient treatment means reduce it by 50%, then you are less than the boundary, and then you don't have epilepsy anymore, by definition, which is not nice. It's not a good definition. Whenever you try to control seizures with whatever anti-epileptic drugs or whatever kind of medical treatment you do, you will not succeed. This is the problem. We had this epilepsy surgery issue. This is something that we are now doing since the 70s. There is an initial success. Yeah? People have no seizures for some time. If you continue and wait, after 50 years, seizures come back. Why? Very simple. You introduce a scar into the brain tissue, you do a structural modification of this network, and you should not wonder that it again seizes. So on the long run, medical treatment, surgical treatment is probably not an option. And that was the idea, to say, if we can predict the seizure, what can we do prior to the seizure in order to prevent the brain in generating such a seizure? You could even argue the other way around and ask, why is there a seizure? Is this a reset? A reset of a critical brain that needs to have a seizure in order to continue with normal functioning? What will happen if you disrupt this? It's not known. I mean, this is the opposite way of thinking. Yeah? During that time, we had the idea that if we can predict seizures, then we can do probably something more localized in time, not just giving constant treatment over years. You have to be on drugs for the rest of your life, but do this locally specific in time and in the brain. That was the initial idea. So how can we probe that? How can we find that there is some kind of an indication for a critical transition, so a transition into, and now we have to define what is the critical transition. The transition into the pre-ictal state, or is this the transition which is critical, or do we find critical transitions from the pre-ictal state into the seizure? This is not clear right now. Yeah? There are many, many ways to do that. This is what you observe if you take a recording, typically done with EEG. Hitten mentioned this morning that there are many, many other ways to have good observables for the brain, but we don't have access to that right now. Not in the way that we would like to have it. Yeah? But at least there is some kind of a transition from something that looks more or less irregular. But in order to function, that your brain can function, you need to have a synchronized state. Not that critically synchronized, not that overwhelming synchronized as what you observe during seizures. But still, your brain is in a synchronized way. And then you see a transition into something that is a little bit more synchronized. And then you get out of that. So physicists. Why does this happen? And how does it stop? Stopping is easy if you think this is energy depletion. No. If you measure the energy depletion, the change of energy in brain during a seizure, you see no change. You can come up with models about that, and then you ask, what is this? This makes this kind of cycling that we observe there. Yeah? And then you find that it does not work. It does not work. I mean, we heard about this morning about the typical classification of seizures in terms of generalized, in terms of it happens somewhere in the brain, but you need to take into account that there are many, many other aspects. Nobody has asked this morning what is unknown. How much is unknown of this origin? And then you will realize that these generalized and focal seizures roughly make about 30% of seizures that are classifiable. The other 70, we have no idea what this is. Yeah? So from these transition models that we had so far, people had the idea, this goes back to work of Lehnertz, this is something like an overflow. Yeah? You have some reservoir, you fill this up with the shit that you experience every day until it overflows, and then you will have a seizure. Okay, good. If you have something like that, you will find some kind of modifications in brain dynamics. Yeah, this is the typical spiking. You have this chirp-like dynamics that you find on the EEG, and then you say, yeah, this is some kind of a nice model of that. Yeah? Then you come up and say, okay, how can we observe this in many, many other patients? And then you see completely inconsistent. Yeah? Inconsistent in the sense that during that time, when these methods came up, you need to take into account the data recording was expensive. Running an EEG for a really long time was extremely expensive. And then comes the argument, what do you need to store? Storage capacity was extremely expensive. Today, this is easy. You can put this on a stick if you want, a week of EEG recording or longer. Yeah? But during that time, it was only the information stored because the clinicians need to make some decision. And this is only the seizure that you had. So you have a little bit of information about the dynamical state of the brain a little bit prior to and maybe a little bit afterwards. Nobody looked into what is going on in between. Yeah? So in that case, if you take this cycling model here, you have this ictal state, the seizure. We know the post-ictal state, this is what typically clinicians observe in subjects. If you ask people, neurologists in their lifetime, how often do they see a seizure? What would you guess? How often, how many seizures have they seen as a practicing neurologist, not in a specialized department? Any idea? It was correct, Albert, 4. 4 seizures, lifetime. You can ask these people. What they typically find is the post-ictal state, because then the patient come into the emergency room, and then you see these patients, what are they doing? Yeah? But this is not during the seizure. The rest in between, the so-called interictal state, this is mostly not characterized because patients behave typically normal. Yeah? Nobody would study the normal brain dynamics for what? Then came Fernando Lopes da Silva. Dynamical systems theory. Wow. Yeah, we have 2 transitions. One is an attractor hopping between 2 attractors, probably noise-induced. This was the famous model for generalized seizures. Well, makes sense. You need to ask, what kind of fluctuations do you need in order to hop from state A to state B? What does this mean? Not an idea. Yeah? If you ask, is this predictable? You would probably say no. Yeah? So the other side, this is some kind of a gradual change where you bring the 2 states together. somehow, I had no idea what this means. You bring the states together, you deform the attractors such that they get closer in state space, something like that. And then you need to ask, what is this? What makes this state transition? And you go back to the literature, you see, you ask the patients, why do you have this seizure? Yeah, this is always the same. It's Monday morning, and then the bird is singing, and then they don't get my coffee, and then there's some shitty on the radio, and blah, 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 blah. Some kind of noisy input, and that produces then the seizure. This is the exogenous factors. Endogenous, if you ask, do you have something that makes you realize that there is something? And then you say, yeah, I have sometimes the impression that the seizure is coming. This is the so-called aura. And we know today that the aura is the beginning of the seizure. It is nothing that is separate, that can be separated from the seizure. This is already the beginning of the seizure. So that was the idea. There is at least some way to do something. And that triggered then a huge amount of studies going into the direction of EEG analysis with different types of techniques. And if I say different types of techniques, if I would do this now in a lecture, that would give me at least 2 days. This is the whole battery of what you think you can do in order to understand some signal. That can be roughly separated into linear and nonlinear, so any kind of frequency decomposition, any kind of autoregressive modeling, whatever is available. Everything has been done. Yeah? And the output was, there is no change. Then people used the nonlinear world. And all of a sudden you see something. You see changes if you estimate dimensions, Lyapunov exponents from data. You see that there is a change prior to the seizure. Good. At least we have some kind of an indication. The question is, what does this mean? I mean, as physicists, we have some idea. If we see a reduction in the dimension, the system gets probably a little bit less active, less complex, more simple. If you see transitions in the Lyapunov exponents, you can talk about stability, you can talk about orders or disorders. If you use some kind of entropy estimates, you will find something. Explain this to the clinicians and try to find some analogy to physiology. Not clear what this was. At least what we had with this was some ideas about that there is some kind of a transition. So the existence of a pre-ictal state. Good. If you ask how long is that, and this is now interesting, depending on what you analyze and which brain dynamics you analyze, you find something between minutes and hours before the seizure. That was the big hope. If we are somewhere in the range of couple of 10 minutes and longer, you can imagine what you can do then. Yeah? You can either warn the patient and say, go into some safe situation, do something else, do some kind of self-prevention, or you have something, even doesn't matter how long it takes, to bring something into the brain, to bring it over the blood-brain barrier, whatever you're doing, you have enough time to do something. In the hope it will prevent the transition into the seizure. There's a but. If you want to do this in subjects, in epilepsy patients, everybody had this idea, we have an implantable device. I mean, today we have something like that. Now, we have already talked about this responsive neurostimulator. This is already some device that can do something like that. Yeah? How sensitive is this? How specific is this? If you have epilepsy, I would implant a device into your brain that makes some alarm every 10 minutes. And you know your next seizure will be in 3 months. What would you do with that device? Throw it away. Yeah? The problem is the sensitivity and specificity. We had, for the first conference, we shared data from different centers, from different subjects. We used all these different techniques that were available during the time and asked, how good are we? And what you see there on the right, on this lower plot, this is the area under the receiver operating curve. And what you find, you can take whatever you want. You always end up with something like 0.8, which is, from detector theory, a very good result. But something that you would need to take into account, and we go into that next week, the statistics for that has some assumptions. The worst case scenario is we have a distribution that consists of one single peak against something that is filled with millions of data. What will win? Yeah? So for that, you would need to have completely new concepts. These concepts are available, but nobody uses them because it is so nasty. You can't build this into machine learning. Of course not. Yeah? But if you find that, and if you use these techniques, and you see that there are only a few concepts that give you relevant information, this is fine. Okay, why not? That was, we take the information that we have from the clinicians, this concept of an epileptic focus, that it must be there. Another question, you have an extremely complicated system. You put a sensor somewhere because somebody told you, put it there. You observe some dynamics. And then you see that at this position, there is something that looks like a seizure. And now comes the critical point that people then say, this is the origin of the seizure. This is where the seizure is being generated. And this is not true. This is some point in this three-dimensional space where you have access, because you have a sensor there, that you see the dynamics. The generator could be somewhere else. And this is just by chance a pickup of that. Yeah? So we cannot probably rely only on the information that we have from the clinicians. We need to do more. Okay. If some kind of a single trace is not sufficient, then take everything we have. So we are looking for interactions. Yeah? We're discussing here synchronization. What I heard so far was phase synchronization. Nobody talks about generalized synchronization. Nobody talks about all the other, how many, 20 different concepts that we have now on networks for different forms of synchronization. If we look for correlations, this is what fMRI is doing, we are looking for amplitude correlations. If you look for amplitude correlations on the EEG, you find nothing. We saw that. It's some kind of oscillation of a 1/f signal that shows some correlations to another 1/f signal. Ooh, fascinating. Yeah? There had been so many ways to study that. And now comes the critical point. If you use this information and you ask, what is going on prior to a seizure, you will see a desynchronization. What is this? It could be that the brain goes into some kind of an idle state. Leave me alone. I will have my seizure now. Now we can continue. Yeah? This phenomena, and this is where you have most of the time of the longest pre-ictal duration, this goes up to 4 hours. This is not in the epileptic focus. This is not an interaction between the clinically defined seizure onset zone and its surrounding maybe, but it's somewhere else. Somewhere else, mostly on the non-affected brain hemisphere. If you then say, now we have the seizure precursor, we can identify that, would you like to have some kind of a stimulator in your healthy brain tissue? You will not even be able to bring this to the FDA and say, hey, I have a device that can control seizures, but unfortunately I have to bring this into the brain region which has nothing to do with that. Next, go home. Yeah? What is this? What does this actually mean? Yeah? So if you take this model and you think in terms of some kind of a potential, the focal area, this is basically the minimum of some potential. This is something that the clinician also can identify. Then you have something like a surrounding. Nobody knows what this surrounding is. Nobody knows what the epileptic focus is. We have some kind of a decision-making rules to identify that. Everything is based on observations of seizures and probably a little bit of other information from PET, from whatever metabolic studies you can take. You have then this kind of focal area. And then you have, of course, you can then define some kind of a surrounding, and then you have something that is remote with the rest of the world. Interestingly, if you use this and you study these kind of interactions, you see that interactions between these different regions, if you take that as granted, live on different timescales. Yeah? So if you are sitting within the focal area and you have your sensors only there, then you will see short-lasting interactions prior to seizure, which is typically then in the order of a few seconds. And if you then ask the clinicians, how well can you define an onset of a seizure, you will find it's typically in the order of a few seconds of uncertainty, because this is school dependent. Yeah? So everything that is in the range of a few seconds doesn't mean anything. It could be the beginning of the seizure, it could be a misclassification, it could be anything. Yeah? If you go for further or long-range connections or interactions, you will also find that all these interactions are mostly driven due to some kind of nonlinearities. So that was the reason why you would need to have some kind of other concepts and to have a better characterization of interactions, not just simple correlations. That does not work. This is not sufficient. You would need to have more. Yeah? So this is, of course, stolen from nuclear physics. The concept of a critical mass. You build something up. You have what Hitten said this morning, and we heard also some other aspects of this. This is a loss of inhibition. This is some kind of a recruitment phenomenon, some kind of an imbalance between excitation, inhibition. Yeah, that makes sense if you are sitting on a single neuronal level. But if you think in terms of larger brain regions, this is probably leveled out. You won't see that. So, and then came Susan Spencer and mixed that up. And now we have the network theory of epilepsy. We heard many things about networks this morning. We have this default mode network and the language network and this network and that network. The brain is a network. Who does not agree? Okay, everybody agrees this is a network. So it's fascinating to set up a network theory of the brain. Yeah? The point is, on what scales? And how does these scales change over time? And this is the critical part here. Yeah? So what can we actually define? And the good news is, if you take the now graph theory and complex system theory, you can do many, many more things, and you will find, again, many, many new fascinating information about pre-seizure states. I will show you some examples here. What Hitten said this morning, it is not, the network theory of epilepsy is not related to, I have a bunch of neurons that behave strange, and I call this then the epileptic focus, and this is embedded into another network, so it's something like a single node of the rest of the world. No, it's not. Yeah? It is much, much more. If you use concepts from network theory, we need to define on how we derive networks. We had this distinction already. We have the structural network. This is the whole connections of whatever we have in the brain. Not just neurons, but we also would need to take into account connections to glia cells, something that is always missing in most of the models. And glia makes roughly 3 times more than the neurons. Why do you omit that? Because you cannot classify glia cells, because they look like a blob. You're chewing gum like that, and then you have a glia cell. Neurons are well defined, they have a shape. so you can identify them even under the microscope. Yeah. You set up a network from all the observations that you have. This is then the so-called functional network. How we do that, what is behind that, what are assumptions behind that, I will give a lecture on that. You will also see that this is a highly inverse problem. And you know, due to Helmholtz, this does not have any kind of a good solution. Yeah? So we need to take this also into account in the interpretation. The good news is in network theory, you have many, many concepts that you can use to characterize such a brain, from the macroscopic scale down to the microscopic scale. Yeah, you can ask, does the clustering coefficient of the brain for a given time frame changes if you go to a next time frame? If you go into a seizure, you will see that there are changes. Something that you all can also observe in climate science and in many other sciences where people use the network concept because they have the whole bunch of characteristics from graph theory available to do other kinds of characterizations of brain dynamics. Yeah? Simple thing, you know what centrality is. Have you heard about these concepts? You know that. Maybe not. Centrality is coming from some sociology. You define what is important in a network according to some rules. Yeah? It could be a bottleneck, it could be some kind of efficiency of transport, whatever how you define relevance in a network or importance in a network. You can do the same and ask, is the clinically defined epileptic focus really a central node? Never. Not even during seizures. Not even if you take all the different concepts that are available. There's a periodic system of centralities, if you like, if you want to do this. You will never find the epileptic focus as a central node. It doesn't exist. The good news is you can use all these different techniques and derive new concepts for defining seizure precursors. And that works much, much better than the classical concepts. In terms of physiology, I see a change in the assortativity of a functional network in time frame blah, 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 prior to a seizure. Then the clinicians come and said, you said what? Change in assortativity. Mm-hmm. And what does this mean physiologically? Forget it. Yeah? This is the next point that we are faced with in order to understand what is actually going on. The good news is, with these concepts, you can ask many, many new questions that had never been asked before. For example, how resilient is your brain? Then you will see that your brain is never resilient because you have a dynamical system that changes over time. Resilience changes with the sun and the moon. Circadian rhythms, any kind of biological rhythms drive brain resilience. I mean, you are sitting here now since 10 o'clock. You are probably close to sleeping. So your resilience goes down. This is something that you can observe. You can even observe changes in resilience due to different sleep stages if you have the data. What is going on prior to seizures? Resilience goes up. The brain gets more resilient. What does this mean? Leave me alone. I would like to have my seizure. Yeah? So is control, if you want to control that, is this really a good strategy? This is something that needs to be asked if you have all these different things. Yeah? Particularly for controlling and also for modeling. If we come to modeling, I've seen some posters here, some talks. This is what you mostly find. You take your favorite model of the neuron or a bunch of neurons, you make some kind of a mean field ansatz, and then you do something. And what you typically end up with is some ODE. And the solution of an ODE is what? Something that oscillates. And then you say, this looks like a seizure. Not a good choice. If you look at what is available from the single neuron to networks of neurons to mean field models, empty. You hear me? Yeah. It's better. Okay, now it works again. You ask another stupid question. You have a transition from something that is normal to something that looks like seizures. What is normal in your brain? Flat line? Hopefully not. Have you seen models that allow you to build a transition from a 1/f-like behavior into something that is periodic? No? Why not? It's too complicated. Yeah. So this is the good news. I mean, we have from these concepts, we have many, many things that we can do. And then you have your whole battery of what kind of bifurcation scenarios you have. And then you say, oh, this is probably related to that and that and that and that. Yeah? But is this what you see in the brain? Brain dynamics, as I said, brain dynamics over days, over years, looks like 1/f noise with nested oscillations. Nested oscillations, they are rare. And this is what you typically refer to as the EEG bands. And because these EEG bands are so rare, you give them a name. And then you call it alpha band and delta band and theta band and so on and gamma band. Yeah? But you never look at the background. Not so what is mostly there, because that looks like noise. Yeah? What kind of models would you need in order to go from a noise-like behavior into something that is periodic? Any kind of idea what kind of model this is? I have no idea. Yeah? This is the, yeah, Mario, what? Okay, good. I show you something else. This is the dynamics. Where's the network? Upper left. The upper left, this is a minimalistic model of a part of the brain which consists of a lattice of 500 by 500 integrate fire neurons on a small world projected back onto the lattice such that we can generate a video. But I have no idea how to make videos from small worlds. Doesn't matter, it's on a torus. Yeah? Integrate fire with delays. Albert mentioned the relevance of delays here. We also have delays here, but I don't care about what the integrate fire is doing. I know what it is doing. Yeah? What is interesting is the pulse coupling. And if you use only pulse coupling, then you can simulate really large networks. This is a small one that I show here. We did the same also with something like 50 million of these oscillators. You choose your initial conditions and you let it run. And then you look for the Kuramoto order parameter, how it changes over time. Who believes in convergence? No? There is no convergence in this network. This system can generate spontaneously transitions between a disordered state, an almost synchronized state, 0.8, 0.9 in the order parameter scheme, and it self-terminates. And if you play a little bit with the delays, a little bit, you can generate something that is a network-generated rhythm that has nothing to do with intrinsic timescales of these neurons, and it looks like dynamics that you can observe in brain structures where you don't have inhibition. For example, the brain region that lets you breathe. This is a self-generated rhythm in the pre-Bötzinger complex. It has no inhibition. You can take it out, it will continue to oscillate. It can be simulated with that. The flashing that you have in the background, this is also some kind of a self-generated rhythm in these networks. This is only topology. You can make it a little bit more complicated. Ulrike, I'm not sure if you have shown that one. No? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we had this is 100 by 100 Fitsunagumo oscillators on a small world. And there's a chaotic saddle with channels in the background that lets your system transit between different dynamical regimes, between pattern-like motion, between flashing, between extreme events, self-generated. There is no change in the control parameters. It's depending only on the initial condition. If you let this run for months, I think that was months, times number of initial conditions, we found sometimes an attractor. You can ask for the system size. System size is a control parameter here. There is no thermodynamic limit in these models, which is nasty. Yeah? The good news is, once you have that, you can replicate many, many phenomena. And this is work that we did together with Eckhard Schöll and one of his students, where we just took the structural connectivity that we had extracted from some DTI data, use Fitsunagumo on this realistic topology, and then you can also simulate something that looks like a seizure. And if we compare the data that we have from that with the data that we have from seizures, almost perfect match. Makes sense. Yeah? So, what next? We have already many, many things in order to characterize the pre-ictal state. We can also de-line it sufficiently well from other states, sufficiently well. We don't have true data over really long time scales. What Hitten shown this morning, this is recordings with the stimulator, but the stimulator only records data when it stimulates. There is no continuous recording. I haven't seen any kind of device that would allow you really continuous recordings. What people have are snippets of data. And if you take into account that you try to reconstruct the dynamics of some complex network with snippets of data, this is something like doing the Fourier transform with non-equal distributed data. I mean, have fun if you want to do that. Yeah? So it is not clear what we have now. What we would need, according to what we have so far, we would probably need to have better concepts and better models for the transitions. Not just this simplistic one-dimensional systems where you have something like critical slowing down. This is, of course, the prime model. Yeah? You can read this in any of these papers on critical transitions, that the epileptic brain shows some kind of an indication for critical transitions. If you do that, and if you take into account what else is going on in his brain, and not just the few seconds before, you will never find that. There is no critical slowing down. In a statistical sense, if you do this over many, many data, you will find it goes up, it goes down, it does not change. You will find whatever you want to find. Yeah? There are many, many influencing factors that we would need to take into account. Yeah? And then we come back to one of these old models that are, of course, related to this, the theory of Lennox, and that was then put forward also from Pete Engel and others, that we probably have some kind of two fluctuating systems where you have the pathological state that somehow interferes with the physiological state, and whenever you go above some threshold, because of these interactions, you will then probably see that there is some kind of a seizure activity. But this is the tip of an iceberg. what you see then. Yeah? When this really will start and when it and where it starts, this is probably something that we cannot capture yet. I mean, there is hope if we go in the direction that we measure other observables from this brain or from these brains, that we can hopefully get a much more complete picture. But then we can think in terms of what else could be done better. The other point, what does this then all mean? I mean, that was the initial idea from this whole group of people that do seizure prediction, that if we have a state that we can identify prior to a seizure, then we can, of course, think about, can we study the basic mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms that lead the brain into this seizure state? I think, this is my personal opinion, we are not yet there. Yeah? And the next is, of course, everybody hops onto machine learning. But have you asked your machine, what does this mean if an entry in some matrix changes its value in the 16th digit after the comma, and how to translate that into some kind of a physiological meaning? I mean, we have explainable AI. You can set an AI onto another AI. Maybe they can speak to each other. We can't do that. Yeah. Another aspect, and this is the reason why I chose this. I'm not sure, have you ever read this book by Thomas Kuhn? The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You know the Kuhn cycle. Most in the natural sciences, the Kuhn cycle is something in the order of 25 years. So if you want to run around in the circle, then continue with that. There must be some point on this circle where you say, I get out of that circle. I need some kind of a kick of this oscillator that brings me out, and then I do something new. And hopefully we have something like that. Otherwise, we run around in circles. And this is something that you can observe already. Yeah? People rediscover the wheel. Many, many aspects that are known for almost 25 years are now being rediscovered. And with this, I stop, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very enlightening and provocative talk.
Very nice insight as usual, but do you have hope?
Yes. I mean, I would not be here if we don't have hope. Yeah? No, seriously. Critical transition is one aspect. Many people are working on that. We know that the simplistic models are nice to have, but it does not explain everything. There are so many other things that can be done in terms of not just one-dimensional bifurcation systems, take attractor bubbling, whatever is available there, what are observables for that? This is something that needs to be done. And I think if we have all these information, if we bring this together, also with multimodal information that we take on different timescales. Next point, timescale matching. Something that has not been done so far. Yeah, all these physiological signals that will be measured in the future, we need to bring them together. How? Have fun.
My question's about interictal spikes.
Yeah.
What role do they play like in this dynamics? Because you mentioned
For me, an interictal spike means nothing. Yeah? This cycling that we have. If you go back into the literature and you ask something on interictal spikes, you will find the first papers in the 70s. Yeah? And these people talked about the relevance of spiking prior to seizure, after the seizure, during the seizure, far off the seizure. Everybody was looking for spikes because this is assumed to be the hallmark of an epileptic brain. What people are now doing is take the same data again, ask how does the spike frequency change on much longer time scales, but from stimulating systems. It mentioned this morning, the system will start measuring if an amplitude crosses a threshold. An amplitude crosses a threshold. If you ask how many stimulations do you have per day? 20,000? At least. Yeah. You would like to have 20,000 kicks off your brain per day? Then you will see something. Yeah? Then you will also see spikes. That could be a trivial reaction of your brain because you are always being hidden by something that perturbs you. No.
Klaus, thank
Mario.
you. Very, very interesting lecture and presentation. My question is, it's not a question. I would like to know what is your take on, according to you, which could be for the future the most important physiological variable that could be useful for, especially for the seizure forecasting. Probably the autonomous signal related to autonomous system,
sure.
Oxygen, temperature.
Yeah.
I was surprised that the last epilepsy congress, someone talked about change in temperature, brain temperature.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But I know that with functional ultrasounds now that are very trendy also. But according to you, which one could provide more useful information, independently of the methods to study it?
Yeah. Good question. Again, what do you want? You want a characterization of brain dynamics in general, or you want to have a characterization of a pre-seizure state? If you want to go for the latter, what we are currently doing is taking some observation from some observables and claim now we see a change according to some statistical rules, and then we say, okay, this is a good indicator for that. Might be. Yeah. We have to take into account that there are many, many other changes. If you think in terms of temperature, of course, there is some kind of temperature change over the day. Albert has made some studies, some nice study just recently where they included also temperature-dependent synapses. This is something that we can expect in the next future, that even this temperature that connects neurons will be highly sensitive to that. Yeah? So what is a good observable? I have no idea. Yeah? I mean, everybody believed in the EEG because this is, from the measurement technique, the only one that allows you to have continuous reference-free, reference not in terms of an EEG reference, but you don't need to have a reference state. fMRI is a comparative method. It makes some kind of a distinction between what are you doing if you do nothing against what are you doing if you do something. Yeah, and then you do some statistics with that. Yeah? You need to define a reference state. What is the reference state in the brain? This is the big advantage of the EEG. Yeah? If there's something more, no idea. Not yet. I mean, we have you you are the one who have some data. Have you seen changes prior to seizures or around seizures with these devices already?
No, we haven't.
Yeah. So anything else is something that is anecdotally, where people have some device and measured something, some kind of change in energy depletion or oxygenation or whatever, and then, but it's still anecdotally, and it brings us back to the 70s, so again 50 years back, where people studied something around a seizure and then they, by chance, observed something before and said, this is a precursor. No. Yeah.
Klaus, fascinating as always, thanks. I think, what gives me, at least, I think it's good that we have such meetings where we have people from many different backgrounds forcing us to think about this in different ways. When we entered this field, we were asking physicians questions like, what is a seizure? And we were not happy with the definition they gave us. And I think we have to keep going back to very basic questions on epilepsy. A few things. One, there was a note earlier today that temporal lobes, the temporal lobes are more epileptogenic. More seizures come out of the temporal lobe. We might not be looking at anatomy well enough. We have to factor that in. There were fascinating talks earlier today, but by and large, we don't consider the brain in terms of its structure and having subcortical structures, cortex, the interaction between subcortex and cortex, and different sort of aspects. much more complicated network dynamics than what we are modeling currently to allow these sort of changes that we're seeing. You know? Yeah. And also, we have to question every aspect of it. So as the person mentioned, that the spikes, for 100+ years, because spikes are noticed in the brain, it's considered to be excitable, and the brain is excitable. I mean, we have to question, are spikes really a representation of hyperexcitation? Or is this some other phenomenon? I've come to believe that they measure inhibition.
Yep.
And, you know, it's completely opposite what the field believes. But it's that far away from, you know, my perspective, from what the field believes. So anyway, but I think we need to keep asking these questions completely, thoroughly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other question in the room? Okay, let's...
Time to leave. Thank you.
Thank you again. I'll make it extended, extension to all the speakers all the day. So, okay, please. Okay, thank you very much.